Well, good afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States. Bonsoir if you are in Paris. Guten Abend if you're in Berlin. Hello, buongiorno, greetings all around the world to our listeners of Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, which, as you know, is the place where classical music happens. Idagio is a video and streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And I like to bring on guests who are inspiring to learn from, to teach us things. And the gentleman I have today is someone I met a few years ago when he lived in Canada. His name is Alexander Neef. He is the director of the Paris Opera, which I think is a very modest title for someone who's the big boss. Le Grand Chef. It's interesting, Alexander, why is it called director, not general manager, any of those things?
Well, actually, the title has evolved. My title now is Directeur Général. It used to be just Directeur, which is even grander in many ways. It's kind of the art of understatement.
Yeah. And Alexander is from Germany. I don't know where in Germany you're from.
Very close to Stuttgart. I grew up in a very small village, about 30 kilometers east of Stuttgart.
And did you grow up with opera, with classical music, with dance?
No, not at all. I grew up in a household where there was a lot of music, whatever the radio was playing, and a lot of singing also, but not specifically classical music, and certainly not opera. I came to opera through the music education in public school, where we, at that point in Germany, I had from grade 1 to grade 13, 2 hours of music education every week.
Wow.
And then there was the school choir, where we sang, to varying degrees, the classical repertoire up to the Christmas oratorio and things like that. And at some point I just started listening to classical music channel and started taping it, the summer operas from Bayreuth and Salzburg and all of that stuff. And over time I got hooked at quite a young age.
I know that you studied Latin philology and modern history at the University of Tübingen, which is a very famous university. Did you already know while at university that you were contemplating a career in opera?
Time, because it was so far from my reality and the reality of my environment that I was the first in my family ever to go to university. So the goal of becoming a school teacher, high school teacher, already seemed pretty good in terms of social progress. But the passion for opera developed very rapidly during my university years, and all my friends happened to be musicologists or musicians. We went to the opera all the time, taking the train to Stuttgart, go to the opera 3-4 times a week, go to Munich, go to Zurich, go to the other places that were in. And at the end of my university time, through my musicology friends, I met Gerard Mortier, who at that time was in his final years at the Salzburg Festival. And I did an internship there, and that internship kind of pushed me over the cliff and was like, I'm taking the leap. And I did my exams, but I had already concluded that I would not want to be a school teacher. And then I was very lucky that right out of university, Mortier offered me a job at the Ruhr Triennale, which he had just founded and was running as the founding artistic director. And I was an assistant there in the artistic administration for a couple of years. And then he offered me the casting director job in Paris when he was called to run the Paris Opera.
I want you to know that my friend Luciano Pavarotti studied to be a school teacher, and he was a school teacher for a while before he realized that he could do better in opera. He did very well as a teacher. He taught language and he spoke Italian beautifully, but
he sang it beautifully too.
He sang it like almost no one else. your life has been a trajectory, because you're still quite young, of going from important position to important position in different countries, including Austria, Germany, Switzerland, France. Did I say Switzerland? I meant Austria, Germany. Were you in Switzerland too? No.
No.
No. Austria, Germany, France, and Canada is what I meant to say. Now,
and the US.
And the US, Santa Fe, yes. You spent quite a long time in Toronto. I'm mentioning this because Canada is a fascinating country to me. I live in New York, so we tend to think of Canada as the better version of ourselves. And we look to Canada for moral guidance and for doing things just a little better and a little nicer, except for hockey, which is violent. But I remember that I've been a visitor to Toronto, that the company listed itself as the 6th largest opera company in North America, which I thought was very modest, because you could have said the largest company in Canada.
We did say that too, but
okay.
Since we were pretty lonely in that league, right? Because all the other actually all the other professional Canadian companies together didn't equal the COC in terms of budget and number of performances. So there was such a big gap between us and the other companies that comparing ourselves to Chicago, San Francisco, LA, Houston made much more sense as a reference system.
We Americans know that many of our favorite opera singers came from Canada. And what characterized a lot of them is that they were very passionate. And the stereotype is of Canadians being cold, and not cold in terms of rude, but just cooler as a temperament. But you had John Vickers and Teresa Stratas and Ben Heppner, who's a very ardent singer, and many, many others. Maureen Forrester. Canada has a long tradition of creating Léopold Simoneau, wonderful tenor. And I think that people don't imagine a Canadian opera tradition. And I know that you commission new works, and I know that works were done with Canadian themes, and that you used many, I mean, I left out singers, Adrian Pachanka, wonderful Gerald Finley, who's one of my favorite artists. There are so many, and yet it's done in a circumspect way. Was that what you expected when you got to Canada, coming from places like Salzburg and Paris?
Well, I mean, there were two reasons really why I went to Toronto. One was the Opera House, the Four Seasons Center for the Performing Arts, which by the time I was offered the job had just opened 2 years earlier, and my predecessor died 1 year after it had opened, so the company was in need of a general director. And I had worked with some of the great Canadians in Salzburg and in Paris. And I thought, with that opera house and those singers, you can actually build an artistic project that has real interest.
Did you find that
we brought people like Ben Heppner back to the company for the first time in 20 years?
Yeah.
Or artists like Robert Carson, who hadn't worked in Toronto in 25 years.
Who is Canadian and is I can say this publicly, I've said it before, he's my favorite current stage director among opera stage directors. Even if he doesn't care for Rossini, no one's perfect. But it is remarkable the number of people who have come from there and gone out in the world. And you commission new operas. I particularly liked Hadrian, that had Thomas Hampson and the marvelous Carita Matula and the marvelous Thomas Hampson and Ben Heppner. And I'm suddenly blocking the name of the Montreal-born songwriter who wrote it. Rufus Wainwright, yes, of course. And how receptive, how supportive was the Canadian audience to these new works and to your initiatives?
Well, I always found that the audience in Toronto, one of the biggest quality was that they were curious, and they didn't judge it before they had seen it.
I understand.
Which is a big quality. I think with a lot of audiences in more established places, people come with a more or less fully formed opinion of what they're about to see. And I always felt in Toronto there was a lot of latitude to just offer a piece. And we had at that point, a very, very healthy subscription ratio, which helped introducing unusual repertoire because the subscribers actually didn't want to always see the same pieces over and over and over again. But that allowed us to, always have a good balance between the great classics, but also things that nobody had ever seen, Canadian premieres, world premieres. And then it depended what it was. I remember one of the most stunning successes that nobody expected was, since you spoke about Rossini, Momento Secondo.
With Luca Pisaroni and Leah Crocetto, I came for that.
And Elizabeth Deschamps.
Yes, Elizabeth Deschamps.
And Harry Bickett. And, that was like, when I told the team that we're going to do Momento Secondo, everybody's like, oh God, why is he putting that on? And I think the audience, because of the subscriber base, was already on side. And the first performances were not completely sold out, but then the bus got out, and the second half of the run, you couldn't get a ticket anymore because word had gotten out. There was this crazy, amazing opera with this amazing singing in it, and people just went for it.
Yeah.
And, Hadrian was very successful too. I mean, it's a rather accessible musical language too. We did other things like the world premiere of Barbara Monk-Feldman's Pyramus and Thisbe, which I think would challenge any audience, Morton Feldman's widow, which was a very non-narrative, difficult, but still very beautiful work. But people were more challenged by these kind of things than by the more accessible new works.
As we're talking, I'm remembering other Canadians. Barbara Hannigan is a Canadian. It is quite remarkable. Did you find that the Canadian government, the Canadian school systems, the Canadian Broadcasting Company had an awareness of the quality of what Canada produced, or were they polite about it, so to speak?
I think in private, they kind of knew what they were having. But I mean, since we were not a government organization funded by an arts council, which is a third, an arm's length organization to the government, a funding body, and they knew what they were having, I think. But there was only so much they could do, right? In terms of actually providing meaningful funding. Our funding was about 15% of the budget. So it's better than nothing, but it still asks us to generate a significant part of our revenues from tickets and fundraising. The radio at that point, BBC, the CBC had kind of given up on recording opera. And we tried to get back in there, which was a bit of a difficult process, but we were able to embark them on a couple of endeavors, one of them being Hadrian. So overall, I think there was an appreciation and a pride.
Mm-hmm. Remind me, the Four Seasons Center opened with a ring cycle, Wagner ring cycle?
Yeah, it did.
So you were there for that? Was that when your predecessor?
No, I came 2 years later.
You came 2 years later, okay. Because I was the person engaged by the CBC to present the ring cycle on Canadian radio, and it was a pleasure. My challenge was that I didn't see the production. So I had to teach the ring that was in my head rather than the one that was on the stage in Toronto. I did this introduction about Toronto and about Canada in part because I respect that company and was glad to meet you there and see what you made with the company, but also because, frankly, I see Canada and the Canadian Opera Company as sort of a middle ground between some of the European traditions and some of the traditions of the United States in terms of, let's call it, commerce, government support, a political and social connection to the opera company that is the leading company, in this case in Toronto, and then the environment that you live in Europe. I recently, in June, had Helga Rabel-Stadler, who was the longtime president of the Salzburg Festival, and she gave a beautiful explanation of how it works and what's behind it. And she's now retired as president after 26 years. I've had people, I had Christina Skeppelman, who worked in Oman, worked in Barcelona, worked in Washington, is a German and spoke about the German educational system as you just did, although she said it's really declined in terms of music. And now she heads the Seattle Opera. So I've had people who can speak to both realities. And you are, I believe, another one of those people in that you know North America very well. You are a European, and you are now the head of an opera company, Directeur Général, Monsieur, that to me is one of the greatest opera companies in the world. Now, that could be obvious to say, but before the pandemic began, my next theater ticket and my next trip was actually to Paris. And I was planning a symposium for the New York Times that would have taken place next April in 2022. Because I believe, and I've always said this, and people don't agree, but I don't care, that the best city in the world for opera is Paris. Not the best single theater. We could argue that all we want, but the best city in the world for opera is Paris, because there are two theaters in the Opéra de Paris. There's the Garnier, the old theater, and the Bastille. There is the Champs-Élysées. There's Châtelet. There is the Opéra Comique. There are all kinds of smaller companies. There are presenters who do operas in concert. There's the new Cité de la Musique. It's remarkable. And the other thing about Paris is it has a history as a presenter and as a creator of opera, especially in the 19th century, but really throughout its history. And further, I would add that because these companies, its ballet company and its opera company, were founded in royal times before the French Revolution, the roots of the tradition are very deep. The codification of tradition, especially in ballet, is very profound. We know that in the 19th century, Paris was the magnet for Meyerbeer, and I recently had his biographer on my show, Wagner, of course, but also Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, Verdi. People came from everywhere to present opera in Paris. And I should add further that the Garnier didn't open until 1875, I believe. So therefore, theaters before that presented opera as what we now call the Paris Opera. It's a very detailed, long history of names and governments and all that, which connects closely to French history. But I stand by my statement that I think Paris is the best opera city in the world. What do you think?
I'm not going to contradict you there, okay. Because it's true that the richness of the landscape is quite astounding. I mean, you know, when I think of my current company alone, between the two theaters, we offer 4,800 seats a night for opera or ballet, and we do around 400 performances in both theaters combined every season, which is a volume of almost 900,000 tickets. That's only us, and then you named the other ones, the Opéra Comique, the Champs-Élysées, Châtelet, which doesn't do that much opera anymore now, and some of the concert performances that happen at the Philharmonie. So there's an incredible variety and an incredible volume of on offer.
I'll say
it's great to be in that. It's great to be in that environment because it's very inspiring. I mean, you can complement your own offer. Like we do try and talk to each other about our respective programming, so that not everybody's doing the Marriage of Figaro at exactly the same period to the same season, and take inspiration from that too, and play with the genres. You know, there's obviously pieces that live much better at the Opéra Comique than they would at the Bastille, the Garnier. But there's also overlap. I think there's a way of doing things in different spaces that really shed a new light on the same piece.
The way I was taught, and maybe you have a different opinion, it is the ballet tradition in Paris that is older, and many people in your chair and elsewhere in Paris Opera have said to me, it has been the ballet that pays for the opera. That because it's less expensive to present ballet, and because the Paris Opera Ballet is a remarkable company with its étoile, its stars, that presenting ballet helps add to the budget, and not just currently, but historically.
I think it's a little bit, it's a question of how you count your numbers, actually. Because the ballet and the opera share the orchestra. We have 154 dancers on permanent payroll, which of course is much superior than what we have on the opera payroll, soloists wise. So I think when you're in such a big company, every part of the company is always looking what the other parts are getting. So we're trying not to play that game. But we're trying to, what I like to do, because it's also very unusual that there's very few companies in the world where the ballet and the opera are equal pillars, right? So I like to try to think them together in terms of what they afford us in terms of breadth and reach, because the ballet has one great advantage over the opera is it can be more traditional and more avant-garde at the same time and in the same season. Right? They can do the very, very traditional classic ballets from Giselle to the great Nureyev productions from the 80s and 90s, to an avant-garde ballet that uses recorded music, or that can be what we've done recently, that brings live pop music to the opera house. And that also an opera tends to use, the artistic collectives, orchestra and chorus, and is a little bit more confined that way. But the two of them together, you can reach an incredible strength.
I think it's important to point out that historically, opera in Paris, by design, the so-called Grand Opera, included dance. And many of the famous works, even Tannhäuser, famously by Wagner, and Don Carlos by Verdi, included dance more than they might have elsewhere. And obviously all the famous Parisian works included dance, almost all of them. That brought work to the dancers, so to speak, but it also changed the style and the taste of opera in Paris compared to other places where it was not necessarily an element, where there might be a little, in Le Nozze di Figaro, they dance a little bit at a wedding, but it's not about a big dance sequence. It's part of the story. You were talking about having more dancers on payroll than singers, but dancers don't eat as much as singers, so that it sort of balances out.
That's a misunderstanding too. No, but what is true, when Louis XIV founded the Royal Academy of Music, or he actually just gave the privilege to Monsieur Perrin to run a opera and dance company, and then later that was more institutionalized. But the French opera tradition, of course, is singing and dance in one show. And actually, that continued for quite a long time. And only in the 19th century was still the first independent story ballet. Until then, ballet had been a very important part of an opera performance, but was not regarded as an independent art form.
So when you say, would Giselle be an example of an independent story ballet?
Yes, I think Giselle was not the first one. It was one of the first ones. I think it was La Sylphide or something like that. It was the very first independent story ballet. But and so that's different. I mean, in the Italian tradition, very often, or even in the 19th century, later 19th century French tradition, there were no separate ballet performances. Very often there was an opera, and then after the opera, they gave a ballet.
A pastoral,
the world premiere of Othello, there was a ballet later in the evening.
Really?
Yes. And that is quite, when you look at old posters, you can always see this opera, it's usually the headliner, and then a bit lower on the poster says, and then after the opera, I just thought that ballet will be given. And those were usually also long ballets, not half an hour. And you can see it even from the 1860s, the posters of what they then called the Imperial Opera in Napoleon III's time. You give like Don Giovanni, and then after Don Giovanni, there's a ballet. That has nothing to do with Don Giovanni, but it's the idea of spending a really extended amount of time at the opera house for a full evening of entertainment.
I first went to Paris in 1975 and 76. I was a teenager, and I lived there as a student. It was very much la vie bohemienne, and I lived in the 5th arrondissement, and I lived on very few francs a day, and it was the kind of poverty, student poverty, that seems very romantic, and I don't regret it one bit, because there were so many things that I could do as a student for free or nearly free. But at that time in Paris, the offering for opera was very poor. There was only the Garnier, and they often didn't present things. There was an opera that they called relâche, in other words, the night off, relax, and in Paris. My goal was to work in opera. I already worked in opera, but I didn't do that much in terms of opera at that time because there wasn't much. There was no Bastille yet. Some of the Pleyel at that time and Champs-Élysées were not really presenting much opera. So I went to symphonic concerts. I went to all kinds of cabarets, and Peter Brook was directing. So I'm not complaining, Giorgio Strehler. So that it was a wonderful creative time then, but not for opera. So that's why I think that the changes for the better that have happened in Paris through the decades, I've seen them and I've been able to participate in a couple of them, have been remarkable. And I miss it terribly, I have to tell you. I'm very glad you're there. I want to fantasize about the season that you have coming up because it's really amazing. I would go to almost everything that you're presenting, and not just because they're operas that either I know well or operas I don't know that interest me, but the casting is really good. And so I want to talk to you. I know that you were a casting director in the past when you worked with Mortier. What is your approach to casting of the operas? If you'd like to name one or two that, for example, Oedipe that is on right now, has a remarkable cast. It's by Ionescu. How do you approach casting?
Well, I think it's not about casting. It's really about programming. Because I think there's no way of planning in an abstract way, right? In order to put on a successful opera, you need a couple of elements, because you can't just decide to do a piece in most cases, right? You need to have, in most cases, a good director, a good conductor, and a good cast, right? And that together with the rep. All of this is kind of, for me, you plan on 4 levels at the same time, all the time. And it's easier for revivals, obviously, because the productions exist, you know what they are. But what is interesting, what I learned from Mortier in planning, is that the most crucial element often is the conductor, and you start with that. Someone who holds it all together in the pit, every performance. And then you also try to build teams that you think can actually get along with each other. Right? It's not any conductor works with, any singer or director, and the other way around. So what I've always been trying to do is to build teams that go in the same direction and bring the thing to success. And I think it's when that works out, it's the most satisfying way of putting in a performance anyway. Mm-hmm. So, and in terms of Oedipe, which we just opened last week, when I got appointed, I really wanted to do a piece to open my tenure in Paris. That was one of our pieces, like a piece that we had created there. It was created at the Garnier in 1936, so relatively late. But as you said before, there's a tradition of new opera in Paris that goes back to Lully and Rameau. So quite a deep, long history, and then for all the 19th century and so on. And then, of course, you think, well, who do you do it with? And in the case of Oedipe, it's really about the title role. And of course, it was one of the titles that I think Joseph Van Damme never sang on stage, but recorded memorably. And I think all the great Van Damme parts are really hard to cast. Because he had such an overwhelming influence on them. Like, who's the next Saint-François?
Yeah.
really on that level, right? And so
I'm
we
going to
were
ask you
quite lucky.
to do us a favor, because I adore Jose Van Damme, but I'm afraid that people younger than you don't know who he is.
Work with him. I had the
No, I
great
know
luck
that
of,
you know who he is, but you're still young, is what I'm saying. But people younger than you may have no
well,
clue
see,
who Jose Van Damme is. And to me,
it's
he's
it's it's actually one of the most important things that for me, that relationship with Jose, because I grew up with his recordings, right? All the, I don't know, you start with all the stuff that he did with Karajan, things like Die Deep. I mean, there's such a rich catalog of things that he did. And then when I went into casting and I went to Paris with Mortier, actually before we did Saint-François, I did Saint-François with José twice in two different productions. We did Golo, we did even later on, we did Traviata, yeah, incredible stuff. And, you know, it's the perfect combination of a magnificent voice, fabulous diction, great musicality, and on top of everything, the nicest person you've ever met in your life. But yet, and you hinted at that before with the Canadian artists, in many ways, Jose was always a little bit like those Canadian artists, a very, very down to earth, nice guy off stage, and on stage he could morph into these incredible characters.
He's Belgian,
right?
by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, he's Belgian, but he reminded me in his attitude of the Canadians. That you spoke about earlier, like, you know, like Ben Hefner too. I mean, what amazes me about, continues to amaze me about Ben is like a really great, nice guy, normal guy in real life, and then he goes on stage and sings Tristan and blows your mind, right? And so that was one of the most satisfying encounters.
I was going to say that I got to work with Van Damme just only once. He was Leporello in Don Giovanni. And he was extraordinary. And I've worked with many wonderful Leporellos, but he was different. He was very down to earth, the way that character can be, but also was our commentator and guided to the world of Don Giovanni. And that's what made it so distinct. The opera to me was not Don Giovanni that night, it was Leporello, because he in effect made us understand why he loved and hated his master that way. So I agree with you, marvelous artist to build upon in your approach to building productions. Are there other artists like that you were influenced by, who you now use as templates for productions or roles?
Well, there's a couple more. I mean, we spoke about Ben Hefner before, and Ben is kind of the same thing. I grew up with Ben's recordings. And then I actually had the chance of working with him quite a bit in Paris and in Toronto. Amazing. Another one, Jerry Finley, Waltraud Meyer, Adrian Pichonka. We worked a lot with Adrian in Toronto. Sandra Radvanovsky, who made her debut in Toronto, debut at the company, and role debut of Aida 10 years ago. And then we had a long history of great collaborations. And
so Sandra, who's wonderful, is American born, but married a Canadian and became a Canadian.
She did.
Yeah. And that was to the advantage of your former company, that you got to have Sandra Radvanovsky, and the audiences did too, in many roles where she would start out. I know you also had Christine Gerke doing roles that maybe she was doing for the first time anywhere. Was that your idea to do that? Did these artists approach you and say, can I try out my Brunhilde with you?
Well, the thing is that the Toronto house has one of the best acoustics in the world. So it was a great place for people to try out things for the first time. And, you know, over my couple of first years, and Sandra helped with that greatly, because she just, you know, in the end, if you do the right things with the right artists, they become your best ambassadors.
Yeah, true.
Right.
That's
so Sandra was one of them. And with the reputation that we built for the house, we actually attracted quite a lot of people to do important role debuts. And Christine Gerke, who you mentioned, did all her Brunhildes in Toronto for the first time. And we were very lucky to be able to build those relationships.
Yeah. So let's get back to the upcoming season at the Opéra de Paris. And maybe now's the time to say that you've just hired a new music director. Who is that?
Gustavo Dudamel was just in Paris last week for his opening concert, which can still be watched actually online on our online platform, which is chez-soi.operadeparis.fr. So yeah, I'm very excited about this appointment, which came around in a very organic way, actually, because I didn't have a music director on my project when I was appointed in Paris, because Philippe Jordan, who had been the music director for 12 years, had already announced his departure for the Vienna State Opera. And I thought, if they appoint me, the first people to talk to are him and the musicians about what should come next. And Gustavo had been in Paris in 2017 for a new production of La Bohème, and it was just a name that kept coming up over and over again. And so I thought, doesn't cost anything to ask. And we got into a very fruitful, easy conversation about it, and were able to announce the appointment back in April.
So here actually this is my production mind turning. I'm a New Yorker. I love my city, but we have messed up terribly in the fact that we've never managed to have the Olympics, whereas Paris and Los Angeles will have had it 3 times. And Paris is next in 2024 and Los Angeles in 2028. Gustavo Dudamel is also music director of the wonderful LA Philharmonic in Disney Hall. You may know that you were a very young man when this happened, that the Los Angeles Olympics coincided with the founding of the Los Angeles Opera. And I was involved in that. There was first a Falstaff and then a Turandot, and they came together. And LA's growth as an arts capital, and it's a wonderful place for the arts. Again, I say this as a New Yorker, there's some rivalry, but I have great respect for the cultural life in Los Angeles. And can you envision opera? There are Olympic operas from the past. They're French, actually. There's one Italian Olympic opera and a couple of French ones. Some kind of co-production of Los Angeles and Paris with Dudamel conducting?
Well, we have started talking about that.
Okay.
With the horizon of 24 and 28. So stay tuned.
Okay, very good. Let's go back to the coming season. I know that, in effect, they're all your children, all these productions and all of these ideas and so on. Talk about some of the things you wanted to highlight or accentuate. I know there's a strong presence of French language opera, which is great. How did you approach creating this new season?
I think it's 4 or 5 very simple principles. I mean, and before I say that, I should say, for me, when you have the opportunity for planning a season that includes, between 20, 22, 23 titles, you can really go broad. And I think it's important for the audience to understand that opera has an incredible richness and diversity, and that each time you come, it's going to be different. So you can go, I think the earliest piece we're doing is Rameau's Platée, and that goes it's actually the Academy is doing Monteverdi's Opéra, which is even earlier. So that goes right to Kurtag's Endgame, which is a piece that was just premiered a couple of years ago. So there's a very broad range there.
I'm just going to say parenthetically, Fin de Partie by Kurtag was presented, I forget if it was Salzburg or Vienna, and then La Scala.
Well, it was La Scala in Amsterdam.
La Scala Amsterdam, okay.
Yeah. So the idea within that broad frame is to show the variety of the art form and the excitement that the art form provides in so many different languages, styles, and from different periods. And then more specifically for the Paris Opera is obviously what I talked about earlier, our own repertoire, like the pieces that we created, of which we're doing Oedipe, Iphigénie en Tauride, and Platée. There's quite a few this season. Then the French repertoire a bit more broadly in general, You had Faust, which was not premiered at the Paris Opera, but became an important part of its repertoire. A piece like Massenet's Cendrillon, which also wasn't premiered at the Paris Opera, which we're actually bringing to the opera for the very first time, so entering the repertoire. Then you always need a good amount of classics. There's nothing wrong with them because the classics tend to be masterpieces. Nothing wrong with programming a masterpiece. And then the last part would be operas of the 20th and 21st century. And there's also a very specific idea behind that. You know, we're doing this season, we're doing pieces that are as varied as Elektra, Wozzeck, Oedipe, Turandot. Those three are all from around the same time. And I want the audience to make those connections, that what they think about as contemporary or modern music is not a homogeneous thing. And then, you know, later in the 20th century, we do the company premiere of Bernstein's Quiet Place, which is yet a completely different beast. And you go from there to Cotard's Endgame. And then later, a bit later in my tenure, there will be the occasional world premiere as well, adding to that canon of 20th and 21st century opera. For me, it's also a lot about in the contemporary realm, about doing pieces that haven't been done in Paris a second time or in a different production, or just inviting a production like we're doing with Endgame. Because one of the problems of establishing those pieces in the repertoire is if only you do them only once, how will they get rooted? Right.
I would like to nominate a 20th century opera that I would love to see in Paris. It was written in Paris. It's the last opera by Jules Massenet. It's Cléopâtre, and it has a wonderful poison aria. It's a wonderful scene. I would like to see Elena Garancia play the role. I will come whenever you do it, I promise.
Did we premiere it, or did someone else premiere it?
I don't know who premiered it, but I know it was written in 1912 in Paris.
Because his last operas were almost all of them were premiered at the Garnier. I think Ariane,
yes.
Bacchus, that was all done at the Garnier.
Right. And I think it's a much neglected opera. It's one that I've studied a lot, and somehow there has been a Massenet revival, and there's a wonderful archive in the Garnier. There was a wonderful exhibition a few years ago about Massenet. And I know the conductor, Richard Bonning, has done a great deal of research about Massenet in Paris, in the Garnier and elsewhere in the archive of the Paris Opera. But I think it's the missing one. And so
noted.
I nominated that. And then a century before, composers like Opéra, I think, are ready for their close-up. There was a Manon Lescaut that I think we're ready to see. And the first Manon Lescaut, even before the Massenet and the Puccini. So, but do you, when you pick the operas that you're going to do you decide which of the two theaters, the Garnier, which is very classical, and the Bastille, which is very modern, do you factor that in? Some of these productions were created for one or the other theater, but if you're doing a new production, how do you decide where to put it?
Well, we do today at the Garnier mostly classical and pre-classical repertoire, and sometimes the odd contemporary piece of a smaller scale. All the other operas are going to the Bastille because it's a better, the acoustics are better at the Bastille, and in terms of what you can put on production-wise, it just gives you more possibilities. I mean, Garnier is a theater also. I mean, you know, you really don't know how they did it in the old days. When I look at my really overflowing pit for Oedipe, I don't know how they fit that into the pit at the Garnier for the world premiere, or Saint-François. So if you have a larger theater at your disposal for the bigger repertoire, it actually does work better there. So we do a little bit more ballet at the Garnier than we would at the Bastille, and a little bit more opera in the Bastille than we would do at the Garnier.
How are the sight lines in the Bastille for opera? I'm sorry, for ballet.
Oh, they're much better because in the Bastille, as you know, is a fan-shaped auditorium.
Right.
So there's practically no bad seat.
Whereas in the Garnier, how are the sightlines?
Well, it's an Italian horseshoe theater. So there's a good number of seats at the Garnier where you can enjoy a view of the auditorium, but not so much a view of the stage. But people do come for that. I mean, there's a lot to see in that auditorium too.
Yeah.
Including a ceiling by Chagall.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's, there are the pyramids in Egypt. There is the Garnier. There is maybe Mount Fuji. There are a few things, but one of them is the Garnier, the opera house. It's really a shrine. And I've worked a lot at La Scala. I adore La Scala. And it's a wonderful theater, but it's a different environment, say, than the Garnier, which is just, you're dazzled. The Vienna State Opera has some of that, but not to the same degree that the Garnier did, even before the Chagall ceiling. It was a stunning, stunning place. Let's go back to this coming season. You have integrated opera, dance, concerts, symphonic music. I know that you are very eager to get more people into the theater. I know things sell very well and that there are very positive prices for younger people and certain other groups. But I know that you want to extend the Opéra de Paris outside the walls of your two theaters. How are you doing that?
Well, we already had a fairly robust program of broadcasts in place, mostly with the public French broadcasters or European broadcasters like Arte and so on, Medici and others. So that stays in place. But we did launch during the pandemic our own online platform so that we could produce and distribute our own content directly. The platform I mentioned earlier, which allows us to have more control over the product, and with a mix of paid and free content, also have a curatorial policy that allows us to do anything, like from the big story ballets and Magic Flute to very niche contemporary programs, and really showcase the whole range of the company.
There's a word that is used a lot about opera, and I try not to use it. I will say it and then I will discard it. Relevance. In other words, that how opera is relevant to today, how it speaks to us to today. I will name one example from Paris. This was before you got there. At the time of the terrible terrorist attacks a few years ago in Paris, I happened to be there, and they were doing a production that went up of Mozart's Die Entführung aus dem Serail, the abduction from the Seraglio, that starred a really wonderful Lisetta Oropesa. And this was at a time when, I'm going to use, for lack of a better term, there was hate and incomprehension among different religious groups. And this hate was expressed through violence. And here is an opera that seemingly is a comedy. It's a rescue comedy, but it's also about what were characterized in the 18th century as Islamic traditions and ways, as opposed to Christian and Western traditions and ways. And I was very concerned about how this opera would be perceived, but also address these issues. And I don't recall who did the production, but there was something rather brilliant in it, that they put the musicians not in the pit, but on the stage. And they were dressed in the costumes of their different countries of the 18th century. And the music that had a Turkish flavor to it that Mozart composed was played by musicians in Turkish costumes. And by putting them all on the stage, it gave an equality and it gave a relevance, for lack of a better term, that was so elegant and so not underlined, but it was so clear. And that the characters, the characterizations, and especially Lisette, who played it, she really seemed to grasp the political moment. Not as danger, not as menace, not as entrapment, but as lack of understanding, and how to surmount that and gain understanding. And Mozart's music almost always is about finding comprehension and unity at the end of a lot of troubles. And to me, it's one of the great opera productions I've ever seen. And so I point that out as an example of a city, Paris, that was in the middle of all of this violence, and opera spoke to it in very meaningful, very subtle ways. So that's my example for Paris, which is, as you know, a city I adore, not for the romance and the Eiffel Tower, but really for its values. And so in that context and with that premise, how do you see outreach? How do you see connection to audiences that are not the typical opera going audiences in Paris?
I think it's a big subject anywhere, and then there's different barriers for access. They can be financial, they can be cultural, they can be others. Come to shows that they feel featured their kind, if you want. So there's some work that we're doing on diversity, both for the ballet and the opera, that I think is very important. Also because I think what we want to be as a company, we want to be at the center of society. So you need to recognize that society today is not what it was 25 or 100 years ago. So there need to be some consequences. And the question of relevance, I don't really think it's relevant as a question, because in the case of the performing arts, like we're not a museum, right? We're a performing arts company, institution. And our mandate is to keep that heritage alive and add to it, like the heritage of opera and ballet. And the only way we can do that, even for the oldest pieces, is using today's artists for today's audiences, right? And when you have to work with today's artists, they come with their view on those pieces, and that can mean all kinds of different things. But I think the simple fact that we need people of today and an audience of today to realize what we do, it makes it contemporary. And that can mean a lot of things for how production looks, but it's always people of today for an audience of today. And I think that's a very important point, that people understand we're not there to just, reconstruct something that happened in Mozart's time. Well, you're not archaeologists. We're also not musicologists. I mean, all of these sciences, if you want, inform our work, but in the end, what we do is incredibly practical. And it's the interpretation of the artist, or the view that the artists have on a piece, that will bring it to an audience. And people get very focused on productions always, but I always point out to them, the conductor starts with the same bass. The conductor starts with a score that contains more or less information about how that piece is supposed to be played. And people always underestimate how many decisions a conductor needs to make to realize a piece.
A few years ago, I teach at New York University, and I had the great soprano Renata Scotto come and speak to my class. And I asked her, because she's one of the most famous actresses in opera, wonderful actress, in addition to singing. I said, how much did you learn, and from which stage directors did you learn things about the theater? And she said to me, straightening her back, she said, I didn't learn anything from stage directors. What I know about the theater, I learned from conductors. And it imprinted on my mind, because she does know about the theater. So clearly, what you are indicating, what you mentioned about Gerard Mortier, I concur with that. Now, you're talking about today's artist. Another thing I love about your upcoming season is not all of today's artists are 35 years old. And you have a lot of what we used to call veteran artists on your roster. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because even if the voice may have changed from what it was, the level of artistry and the level of knowledge and gift that they can pass to these 35-year-olds is very important. So you have John Tomlinson and Sophie Van Otter, a lot of wonderful artists. Was that intentional on your part?
Yes, because in many ways, yes, because I think it's exactly true what you say, that also, if we want to represent society, we can't only have a certain kind of people on stage, and it includes age, right? Obviously in appropriate roles and all of that, but singing, like being an opera singer or being an operatic artist, it's not only about singing, it's a lot about singing, but it's also about experience, about, you know, experience with the art, but also life experience you bring to those roles. And I think a good opera career, what I'd always tell my young artists is, you know, you're now 25-ish. You need to think about what you're going to do with hopefully 35 to 40 years of singing, right? And how you're going to organize that as a career, but also how the experience you will get will then turn you into a different artist. The voice changes, of course. Nobody, it actually does exist, as you know, that people kind of keep more or less the same voice throughout their career, which poses different kinds of problems. But most voices change. And, you know, all good artists I know never stop working on the voice. You know, and what I learned from artists like Sandra is that the peak of a career, it's not something that you define the same way for everybody, right? What's the right time to sing your best Norma, right? And especially those pieces that, like Norma, like Tristan, like the pinnacles of the repertoire, that of course ask for complete vocal mastery, but also you can't successfully perform them without the life experience that you need to embody the role really and profoundly. And I think it's very important also to put that on stage together with younger artists. I mean, in the end, it's always about pulling everybody up, right, including the audience. And a veteran artist, you know, because I spoke about Anne-Sophie von Otter, and it's amazing. She has a not all that big part in the Deep, but a great performance actually starts before they sing their first note. It starts when they walk on stage, and you take your eyes off.
One of the most wonderful things I saw in this theme was in Toronto, was Don Quixote by Massenet with Ferruccio Furlanetto, a very young and very wonderful Quinn Kelsey, and a very young Anita Rakvelishvili. And
well, Anita did her North American debut in Toronto.
Yeah, and I came for all three, frankly, and because you can tell I like Massenet. And it was such an extraordinary experience. And to have Furlanetto, who is towering in every sense, play this role, something I didn't think I would ever get to see him do in New York. I'm fortunate when we don't have pandemics that I'm able to travel to see our great artists do repertory. And, you know, I usually wind up working in some context, but that was an amazing opera night that I count among my top 10 as well.
Mine too. And, you know, it's as an aside, when I was appointed in Toronto, Ferruccio was singing Don Carlo in Paris, where I was still a casting director. And so when I came back from the appointment in Toronto, from the announcement, and I went in his dressing room before the next performance of Don Carlo, he was the first artist who said, if you're going to Toronto, I'm going to come and sing there.
Good.
And then Don Quixote was really his wish. And we built this amazing little team around him with Quinn and Anita, and it was an astounding performance. You know, one of my astounding performances in that regard was seeing Martha Mödel on stage as the Countess in Peak Down, when she was quite old and didn't have a lot of voice left, but the moment she walked on stage, you couldn't take your eyes off that woman, which was incredible.
Another time, because our time is coming to a conclusion, you and I will talk about artists that we've seen very late in their careers, who in my case, I was a friend, a lover, practically, not physically, but otherwise, of Leonie Rieseneck, and attended her last performances in New York and was supportive for her in ways that she needed, and then went to Salzburg for her farewell. And I knew that she was ill. She did not put the word out to many people, but she was dying of cancer. And she gave these remarkable performances. And in New York, it was the Old Countess. And in Salzburg, it was Clytemnestra. And this is part of our memory and what you and I and people like us pass on when we pass to younger people, what these traditions are, which is why I'm very, I honor you for hiring artists like Van Otter and others, and Tomlinson, who can bring so much to the life of the theater within the theater. So because we're almost out of time, I wanted to briefly, for Untitled listeners, which, given your musical background, you could have picked anything and everything, and it would have been fascinating. But we have a Mozart concert aria, Vorrei spiegarvi Dio. Why that one? It's gorgeous, but why?
Well, so there's a lot of reasons. First of all, the most impossible thing you can ask a music level for is to make a playlist. Right? It's by definition incomplete, and tomorrow I'll make you a different one. So this was a snapshot of what I was listening to at that moment. I was asked to do the playlist a couple of days ago, and then there was a couple of classics that would probably be there all the time. Maybe the recordings change. Vorrei spiegarvi. Gerard Mortier was a big lover of that aria, and so like part of my musical upbringing was a lot of Mozart with Mortier, because Mozart for him was an absolute key artist, key composer. And add to that, the recording I chose is Sabine de Vielle, who's one of the most wonderful younger French singers. There's a great younger generation of French singers coming up right now. Léa Desandré, who's also on the playlist with a little song. It's really a song by Charpentier. Would be in that same category. There's other ones like Julie Fuchs and Benjamin Bernheim and all of those. So that's exciting for me as the director of the Paris Opera, to be able to work with the young French talent and bring them to the fore, or just really give them opportunities in our stages that they might not get everywhere. So that's important. And yeah, it's magic, that aria.
And there's a folk song. I don't speak Icelandic, so I cannot pronounce properly the name of the composer. Hildur Guðnadóttir. Okay.
Yeah. We can try that together. I did that one. I really picked for the artist,
Emily D'Angelo. Yeah,
Emily D'Angelo, who was my young artist in Toronto before she went on to the Met program, and I think she came to us in Toronto when she was 21. And one of the things I said to her at that time, which was in 2016, I believe, I said, I don't really know what you are doing here, because there's nothing we can teach you. So Emily, for me, is like one of the most wonderful upcoming singers. And this is her first album, which is not out quite yet. They've only released a couple of individual tracks. It's coming out. And she's also doing her debut in Paris later this season with Sibel. She's just an artist that I believe in very, very deeply, and that I'm very, very excited about.
I heard her in her Met auditions. I heard her at Juilliard, and she is really wonderful and still quite young. I know that she describes herself as Canadian Italian, the way Isabel Bayrakdarian, I think, describes herself as, I forget if it's Canadian Lebanese or Canadian Armenian. But I think there might be Lebanese family in there too. But Emily D'Angelo, I don't want her to move too fast, if you know what I mean. I think there's so much talent there that I want her to hang out with Anne-Sophie Van Otter for a few days and absorb what being a veteran mezzo is about, and the ethic that Van Otter has. That's just one example, because I'm a big admirer, but there are wise old mezzos.
The great thing about Emily, I've always thought of her as an old soul, if you want. I've always found that she was a young artist that was incredibly good about her decision making, and very, grounded. So I have all confidence that she will take it step by step and give us those 40. I would say to the mezzos and the baritones and the basses, you don't come to me if you don't want to do 40 or 45 years of singing.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Johann Sebastian Bach, I get that. St. John Passion, Johannes Passion. Why of all the Bach, or is that what you were listening to right now?
I was listening, to that particular recording that just came out, and I've been a great admirer of Suzuki's Bach recordings for a long time. And what's special about this recording is it was actually recorded at the Philharmonie in Cologne during COVID as a substitute of not being able to do public concerts. So there's a little bit of a relevance, if you want, to that recording for a moment, and it's absolutely splendid.
My guest last week was Michael Herschel, who is a conductor, very established conductor, who's conducted a lot in Cologne, in fact, who lives in Dresden. And while he is an American citizen, he's lived most of his life in Europe. His parents were opera singers in Vienna and in Germany. And he's a conductor who is a Wagner specialist, but also conducts what's called the New Jewish Chamber Philharmonic of Dresden. And the topic we didn't have time to get to was Johann Sebastian Bach, because he too put Bach in his listings of music that inspires him. And a question I would have asked him, and I will ask you before we close, is I suppose that Bach is not as high in my level of revered composers, not because he's not great, but because he didn't do opera. And Michael said that, yes, but at the base of all of that singing that we have in opera are the cantatas, and that Bach there could have been opera in Bach. So my question to you as an impresario is, can you see in Bach something to do on the stage of the Paris Opera?
Probably not. I don't think that our stages would be a place for a staged Passion, for example. I think there are other spaces where you can do that kind of thing. It has been done beautifully and successfully. I mean, the question, if there was an opera in Bach, I don't know. I mean, he never had the opportunity to write one because the positions that he held didn't require him to write an opera. But when you compare what he does in his vocal writing in the cantatas and the Passions with what Handel does at exactly the same time, with a very, very different approach to writing for voice, very different approach to the character's psychology too. I actually don't know. I mean, it's irrelevant because we have so much great music by Bach that I'm not missing anything. And for me, the complement of the two contemporaries, Bach and Handel, who one of them was way more rooted in secular music and opera, and the other one much more rooted in instrumental music and sacred music, it makes for an almost complete package of complete musical expression.
Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, the late, died way too young mezzo-soprano, did a sort of theatrical version of the cantata, and I'm forgetting now the title exactly, Hab Genug, I've had enough.
Yeah, with Peter Sellers.
Yes, with Peter Sellers, which to me was a gorgeous, I didn't feel they had to make it relevant, so to speak. I felt that it was so entirely in the moment and meaningful as it was. And a few years ago, I was in 2012, the instructor in residence at the Verbier Festival. And one of the things I did was with Thomas Quasthoff, the German bass baritone. And he publicly has said many times that he's an atheist, and yet has sung a lot of Bach sacred music. And I asked him, how, if you are an atheist, do you take on these characters and the message in the music? And he said, it's because I'm playing a role. And whatever one feels about religion or not is not the point here, but the point is that artists of different kinds can make approaches to music that is well beyond their belief system and make it meaningful. And
that's also because the music is so powerful that I think as an interpreter, you almost willingly insert yourself in their world.
Mm-hmm. I can only say that I'm thrilled that Paris has you. I miss you on this side of the ocean. I miss all the things you did in Canada that inspired me so much. This program is about inspiration. And Alexander Neef, I thank you because you do things that inspire me. And that's why I wanted to bring you to the attention of others who will discover what you're doing in Paris and come to Paris to see the works that you and your team are doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation.
And we'll do it sometime live in Paris.
We'll do it live in Paris.